He possessed an instrument that comes along only once in a generation, a deep, warm, mahogany baritone that didn't just sing country music, it resurrected it. He was a troubled boy who outran a prison cell to become a global icon, selling over 25 million records and holding audiences spellbound with a voice that felt exactly like coming home. But behind the multi-platinum albums and the gentle, stoic smile lies a reality that breaks the heart in ways no song ever could. At 66 years old, Randy Travis is a man who survived a catastrophic medical storm that cruelly, methodically stole the very gift that saved his life. A man who endured a devastating stroke that left him with severe aphasia, permanently silencing the most recognizable voice in American music and trapping him inside a quiet, agonizing daily battle just to speak a single word. How does a legend whose entire identity was built on the perfect delivery of a lyric survive when the music suddenly stops? What hidden agonies did he suffer when his personal life shattered into pieces just before his body betrayed him? And what does it teach us about the absolute, unbreakable power of true love when a wife steps into the deafening silence to become the voice her husband lost? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the quiet survivor today, you must first know the reckless boy who was one mistake away from losing it all. The reckless boy, the courtroom, and the velvet lifeline. There's a profound, deeply romanticized myth in American culture about the origins of country music. We like to imagine that the men who sing with the most heart-wrenching authenticity are simple, pure-hearted cowboys who learn to play the guitar on a peaceful, sun-drenched front porch. We want to believe that a voice capable of comforting millions of people must naturally come from a place of absolute peace. But true, undeniable soul cannot be manufactured in a quiet pasture. It is forged in the fire. It is carved out of bad decisions, close calls, and the terrifying, freezing proximity to absolute ruin. To understand the quiet, deeply scarred, and miraculously resilient 66-year-old man that Randy Travis is today, you cannot start with the platinum records or the standing ovations at the Grand Ole Opry. You must start in the mud. You must start with a boy who was doing absolutely everything in his power to throw his life away. Born Randy Bruce Trawick on May 4th, 1959, in the rural, working-class town of Nashville, North Carolina, his childhood was steeped in the heavy, humid traditions of the American South. He was the second of 6 children. His father, Harold, was a horse breeder, a turkey farmer, and a fiercely demanding patriarch who possessed a deep, obsessive love for the legends of country music. Men like Hank Williams, Lefty Frizzell, and Gene Autry. Harold relentlessly pushed his sons to learn the guitar and sing, dreaming of living vicariously through their success. But a father's relentless pressure, combined with the restless, suffocating boredom of a small rural town, often produces a volatile, dangerous rebellion in a young man's heart. By the time Randy reached his early teens, he was not a sweet, obedient country boy. He was a hurricane of self-destruction. He dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. He began drinking heavily. He ran with a tough, reckless crowd, seeking the adrenaline rush of breaking the law to fill the quiet, aching void in his soul. Throughout the mid to late 1970s, the teenager's life spiraled into a dark, chaotic blur of juvenile delinquency. He was arrested for auto theft. He was arrested for burglary. He was engaged in terrifying, high-speed chases with the local police through the dark, winding backroads of North Carolina. Looking back at this dark, deeply shameful chapter of his youth, Randy later spoke with the unvarnished, brutal honesty of a man who knows exactly how close he came to the edge of the cliff. "I was no stranger to the back seat of a police car," he confessed, stripping away the polished illusion of his celebrity. "I was drinking, I was doing drugs, and I was fighting. I was heading straight to prison, and I was going fast. I just didn't care about my life. Listen to the terrifying gravity of that admission. For the parents and grandparents watching this, those who have spent sleepless nights agonizing over a rebellious, self-destructive child, that sentence touches a raw, bleeding nerve. Randy was a boy standing in the absolute dark, practically begging the universe to lock him away. In 1978, at 19 years old, the universe finally ran out of patience. Randy found himself standing in a cold, sterile courtroom, facing a deeply unsympathetic judge. His rap sheet was a disaster. He had been caught breaking and entering, and he had fled from the police. The judge looked down at the reckless teenager from Nashville and delivered a terrifying, absolute ultimatum. He told Randy that if he ever saw his face in that courtroom again, he was not going back to the county jail. He was going straight to the state penitentiary. He was one single, microscopic mistake away from becoming just another anonymous, forgotten statistic behind bars. But inside this chaotic, violent, and broken boy, nature had hidden an impossible, miraculous gift. When Randy opened his mouth to speak, he was a high school dropout facing prison time. But when he opened his mouth to sing, he commanded an instrument that defied all logic. He possessed a rich, resonant, and unimaginably deep baritone voice. It did not sound like the voice of a 19-year-old juvenile delinquent. It sounded like mahogany. It sounded like an old, weary soul who had lived 100 lifetimes. It was a voice wrapped in warm velvet, carrying a profound, unmistakable sorrow that could immediately stop a crowded room in its tracks. And in that crowded, smoke-filled room, a local nightclub in Charlotte, North Carolina, called Country City, USA, that voice found its ultimate savior. The club was owned and managed by a woman named Elizabeth "Lib" Hatcher. Lib was 16 years older than Randy. She was a sharp, fiercely independent businesswoman who had seen countless aspiring musicians walk through her doors. But when she heard the troubled, quiet teenager step onto her stage and sing the classic, traditional country ballads of his youth, she was completely paralyzed. She did not see a teenage criminal with a rap sheet. She saw a once-in-a-generation genius who was drowning in his own despair. When Randy's legal troubles threatened to finally lock him away for good, Lib Hatcher did something absolutely extraordinary. She stepped into the courtroom, stood before the judge, and personally vouched for the boy. She offered to take legal guardianship and full responsibility for him. She promised the court that she would give him a full-time job at her club, keep him off the streets, and keep him entirely out of trouble. The judge, perhaps sensing the fierce, unyielding determination of this woman, agreed. It was the ultimate life-saving intervention. Lib brought Randy into her club, not just as a singer, but as a short-order cook. He spent his days in the hot, greasy kitchen, frying catfish and washing dishes, learning the value of honest, exhausting labor. And at night, he stepped onto the stage and poured his battered, bruised soul into the microphone. This is the incredibly powerful, breathtaking irony of Randy Travis's early life. For most artists, singing is a passion. It is a hobby, or perhaps a dream of acquiring fame and wealth. But for Randy Travis, music was a literal, undeniable lifeline. The microphone was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell. If he did not possess that miraculous, deep baritone voice, if he had just been an ordinary boy with an ordinary voice, he would have undoubtedly rotted away in the dark, violent confines of North Carolina penitentiary. His voice was his ultimate, flawless weapon of survival. It was a key that unlocked the prison door before it could permanently swing shut. Under Lib's incredibly strict, protective, and devoted management, the boy from Nashville began to change. He stopped drinking. He stopped fighting. He realized that the woman who had saved and believed in his talent far more than he believed in himself. Over the course of the next few years, their relationship evolved from a strict manager and a troubled employee into a deep, complicated, and entirely consuming romantic partnership. Lib essentially became the architect of his entire existence, dedicating every waking moment of her life to grooming him for greatness. By 1982, the restless, reckless energy that had nearly destroyed his life had been entirely channeled into a burning, uncompromising ambition. Randy and Lib packed their meager belongings into a car and left North Carolina behind. They were heading to the glittering, highly competitive, and incredibly intimidating epicenter of country music, Nashville, Tennessee. They believed that with his voice and her relentless determination, they were going to conquer the world. But as a young singer with the ancient voice stepped into the pristine, corporate boardrooms of Music City, he was about to discover that escaping a judge in North Carolina was entirely different from escaping the cynical, algorithm-driven machinery of the music industry. The executives in Nashville were about to take one look at the boy who had just saved his own life, and they were going to tell him that his voice, the very gift that had rescued him from the abyss, was completely, hopelessly obsolete. The neon Rejection, the dishwasher, and the traditional revival. If you want to test the absolute, uncompromising integrity of a man's soul, you do not test him when he is standing on top of the mountain. You test him when he is standing at the bottom, looking up at a locked gate, being told that everything he fundamentally is entirely wrong. In 1982, 23-year-old Randy and his devoted manager, Lib Hatcher, arrived in Nashville, Tennessee. They drove into Music City with incredibly high hopes, believing that the town built on a foundation of acoustic guitars, broken hearts, and storytelling would instantly recognize the once-in-a-generation magic of Randy's deep mahogany baritone. But they arrived at the exact moment Nashville was undergoing a profound, highly commercial identity crisis. The early 1980s was the era of the urban cowboy. Country music was desperately trying to cross over into mainstream pop. The raw, traditional sound of the fiddle and the weeping pedal steel guitar had been violently shoved aside, replaced by slick synthesizers, heavy string sections, and drum machines. The industry executives were looking for polished, pop-friendly pretty boys who could appeal to the suburban shopping mall demographic. They were absolutely not looking for a quiet, brooding young man from a North Carolina farm whose voice sounded like a ghost from 1955. Randy and Lib knocked on every single door in Nashville. They sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit boardrooms of major record labels, playing Randy's demo tapes for the most powerful executives in the business. And time after time, the response they received was not just a polite rejection. It was a profound, deeply frustrating insult to his entire artistic identity. The executives listened to his incredibly rich, traditional voice, and they shook their heads. They told him he was unmarketable. They told him his sound was obsolete. Reflecting on this agonizing, humiliating period of constant rejection, Randy later delivered a quote that perfectly captures the absolute absurdity of the Hollywood and Nashville machinery. "I was turned down by every label in town more than once," he recalled, his voice carrying the calm, steady weight of a man who had survived the fire. "They told me I was too country. I didn't really know what that meant. I was in Nashville. How could you be too country in Nashville? I just knew how to sing the way I sang, and I wasn't going to change it. How could you be too country in Nashville?" Listen to the breathtaking irony of that statement. For the older audiences watching at home, those who have watched the traditions, values, and cultures they grew up with slowly get erased and replaced by synthetic, soulless modern trends. This is a profoundly relatable, infuriating moment. Randy was an authentic masterpiece standing in a room full of cheap plastic imitations, and the industry was telling him that he was the one who was defective. With all the doors slammed in his face, the dream seemed completely, mathematically impossible. But Randy and Lib refused to pack their bags and go back to North Carolina. To survive the crushing financial reality of living in a city that did not want them, Lib took a job managing a sprawling, popular nightclub and restaurant near the Grand Ole Opry called the Nashville Palace. And Randy, the boy with the voice of a god, took a job in the back of the house. He became a dishwasher and a short-order cook. Imagine the incredibly visceral, humbling reality of his life during those years. For a young man burning with a desire to share his gift with the world, the environment was punishing. He spent his days standing over sinks filled with boiling, greasy water, scrubbing plates, and frying catfish in a sweltering, chaotic kitchen. His hands were raw. His clothes smelled of cooking oil and stale beer. But the kitchen of the Nashville Palace became the crucible that proved his absolute dedication to his craft. Every evening, after hours of grueling, invisible blue-collar labor, Randy would wipe the grease from his hands, take off his apron, and put on a clean, pressed shirt. He would walk out from the swinging doors of the kitchen, step directly onto the small, dimly lit stage of the restaurant, and he would sing. He did not sing the synthetic pop hits the radio was playing. He sang the old songs. He sang Hank Williams. He sang George Jones. He sang with a quiet, devastating purity that instantly silenced the clinking glasses and the loud chatter of the dining room. And when his set was over, he would quietly step off the stage, put his apron back on, and walk back into the kitchen to finish washing the dishes. He did this for years. He washed dishes and he waited. This is the very essence of true American grit. He did not compromise his soul to get a record deal. He did not let the executives turn him into a pop star. He knew that his voice was a sacred instrument, and he was perfectly willing to fry catfish for the rest of his life if the alternative meant selling out the music he loved. Finally, in 1985, the universe rewarded his uncompromising patience. A sharp, visionary executive from Warner Brothers Records named Martha Sharp walked into the Nashville palace. She had heard rumors about the singing cook. When she sat in the audience and listened to Randy's voice wash over the room, she did not hear an obsolete, unmarketable singer. She heard the absolute, undeniable future of the genre. She realized that the American public was starving for authenticity. She signed him immediately. In 1986, Randy Travis released his debut album, Storms of Life. When the needle hit the groove on the record, it did not just produce a hit song, it produced a cultural earthquake. The album was an absolute masterpiece of pure, unadulterated, traditional storytelling. Songs like On the Other Hand in 1982 featured traditional acoustic guitars, weeping fiddles, and a voice so deep, so unbelievably resonant, that it completely shattered the slick, synthetic pop landscape of country radio. Storms of Life sold over 3 million copies. It became a monumental, historic triumph. Randy Travis did not just become a star. He became a savior. Music historians widely credit that specific album with single-handedly launching the neo-traditional country movement. Randy had done the impossible. He did not adapt his voice to fit the algorithm of the era. By standing his ground, refusing to change, and holding on to his roots, he grabbed the entire country music industry by the collar and forcefully dragged it back home. He proved to the world that authenticity will always, eventually, triumph over imitation. The boy who had been frying catfish in the back of a kitchen just months prior was suddenly performing on national television, winning Grammy Awards, and completely dominating the Billboard charts. He was universally hailed as the new king of country music. He was selling out massive, screaming arenas across the globe. In 1991, the ultimate validation of his entire journey arrived when he married Lib Hatcher, the woman who had stood in that North Carolina courtroom, saved him from a prison sentence, and believed in his voice when the entire world had told him no. They were considered the most powerful, impenetrable partnership in the industry. He had achieved a level of fame, wealth, and artistic reverence that was almost difficult to comprehend. The poor, troubled boy with the rap sheet had built a golden, magnificent kingdom. But there is a terrifying, hidden danger to achieving absolute, flawless perfection. When a man becomes the ultimate symbol of traditional values, purity, and wholesome American culture, the world places him inside a very specific, incredibly tight golden cage. The public demands that he never make a mistake. They demand that he never show his scars. As Randy transitioned into the late 1990s and the 2000s, the relentless, suffocating pressure of maintaining his status as the perfect country gentleman was quietly beginning to fracture the foundation of his soul. The grueling schedule of performing hundreds of shows a year, the overwhelming weight of the expectations, and the silent, unresolved traumas of his troubled youth were slowly gathering in the dark. The man who had spent his life singing about broken hearts and redemption was about to discover that the most devastating storms of his life were not behind him. They were quietly building on the horizon, and the golden cage he had built was about to be violently, publicly blown apart in a sequence of events that would leave the entire world in a state of absolute, heartbroken shock. The king of the radio and the golden cage. In the great, romanticized mythology of the American dream, the story is always supposed to end the exact moment the underdog finally reaches the top of the mountain. We love the climb. We love the struggle. We love watching a boy who washed dishes in a hot, greasy kitchen suddenly hold a platinum record in his hands. We assume that once the summit is conquered, the hero simply plants his flag, breathes in the crisp, victorious air, and lives happily ever after. But the brutal, unspoken reality of massive, global fame is that the summit is not a resting place. It is a tightrope, and the wind blows harder at the top than it ever did at the bottom. By 1987, Randy Travis was no longer just a successful singer. He was a monumental, industry-defining force of nature. His sophomore album, Always and Forever, did not just climb the charts. It completely obliterated them. It stayed at the #1 spot on the Billboard country charts for an astonishing 43 weeks. It achieved multi-platinum status, selling millions of copies to a public that was absolutely starving for profound, unadulterated authenticity of his voice. And then came the song that would permanently etch his name into the cultural bedrock of the United States. Forever and Ever, Amen. When Randy stepped up to the microphone and delivered that impossibly warm, rich, mahogany baritone promise of eternal love, he created a masterpiece. It was not just a radio hit. It became the definitive American anthem of devotion. For the next 2 decades, you could not attend a wedding, an anniversary, or a quiet, romantic evening anywhere in the American heartland without hearing that song. He was universally hailed as the absolute, undisputed king of country music. He swept the Grammy Awards. He swept the Country Music Association Awards. He was invited to join the prestigious Grand Ole Opry, the highest, most sacred honor any traditional country artist could ever achieve. The boy who had once sat in the back of a police car, staring blankly at the terrifying prospect of a state penitentiary, was now wearing custom-tailored suits, performing for sold-out arenas, and shaking hands with presidents. And right beside him, standing fiercely in the blinding glare of the flashbulbs, was Lib Hatcher. In 1991, Randy and his longtime manager, the woman who had walked into that North Carolina courtroom and literally saved his life, were officially married. To the outside world, it was the ultimate unbreakable Hollywood and Nashville fairy tale. It was a beautiful, inspiring narrative of a woman who saw the genius in a troubled boy, protected him from his own demons, and guided him to the absolute pinnacle of human success. They were the ultimate power couple, but a profound, insidious danger hides within any relationship that blurs the sacred boundary between a marriage and a corporation. When a man achieves the level of fame that Randy Travis commanded in the 1990s, his life ceases to belong to him. He becomes a multi-million-dollar industry. And when your wife is the chief executive officer of that industry, the entire architecture of the marriage fundamentally changes. The dining room table is no longer a place to share quiet, intimate moments. It becomes a boardroom for discussing record contracts, tour logistics, and merchandise percentages. The bedroom is no longer a sanctuary. It becomes a waiting room before the next early morning flight. The sheer, exhausting velocity of his schedule was inhumane. Randy was touring for over 250 days a year. He was living on custom-built luxury buses, staring out of tinted windows at the endless, blurring highways of America. He was recording albums, shooting music videos, and performing at hundreds of meet and greets. He had become a perfectly calibrated machine. But machines do not have souls, and Randy Travis was a man of immense, quiet, and deeply sensitive soul. The pressure to maintain the image of the flawless, traditional country gentleman was suffocating. The industry demanded that he never show a single crack in the armor. He could not have a bad day. He could not express the exhausting, suffocating anxiety of living his entire life under a microscope. He had to walk onto a stage in front of 20,000 screaming strangers every single night, smile, and sing about perfect, unbreakable love. But when the stage lights were finally turned off and the roar of the crowd faded into the deafening, sterile silence of a high-end hotel room, a terrifying, creeping isolation began to set in, reflecting on the unique, invisible toxicity of global fame and the relentless demands of the music business. Randy later delivered a quote that completely strips away the glittering illusion of superstardom. "I'm just a guy who sings country music," he confessed, highlighting a profound discomfort with the massive corporate machine he had become. "I never wanted to be a pop star. I never wanted all the noise. I just wanted to sing the songs that meant something to me. But when you get on that treadmill, it just keeps speeding up, and eventually, you're running just to keep from getting thrown off. Listen to the sheer, exhausting desperation in that metaphor. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who spent decades trapped in the grueling, relentless machinery of their own careers, sacrificing their youth and their family time just to pay the mortgage and keep the engine running, that feeling is universally, painfully understood. Randy Travis was running on the most glamorous, high-paying treadmill in the world, but he was still trapped. As the 1990s faded into the early 2000s, the monumental, unbreakable foundation of his relationship with Lib began to silently, tragically fracture. It did not happen in a fiery, dramatic explosion of tabloid scandal. It happened the way most long-term marriages fail. Slowly, quietly, by a million microscopic degrees of emotional distance. They had spent nearly 30 years together. They had conquered the world. But the agonizing reality was that the business had completely consumed the romance. The manager and the artist had survived, but the husband and the wife were slowly suffocating. How does a man who makes a living singing the most profound, emotionally articulate lyrics in the world communicate to his wife that he is drowning? How does a woman who dedicated her entire existence to saving a boy's life accept the fact that the man he has become no longer wants to be managed? The agonizing truth is that they couldn't. For years, they maintained the flawless public facade. They smiled for the cameras. They attended the award shows. They protected the multi-million-dollar Randy Travis brand with absolute, fierce loyalty. But behind the closed doors of their massive estates, the boy from North Carolina was feeling the familiar, terrifying shadows of his youth slowly creeping back into his mind. He was an incredibly wealthy, universally respected icon, but he was fundamentally, agonizingly alone. The golden cage he had built to protect himself from the poverty and violence of his childhood had become a prison of a completely different design. As the calendar slowly approached the fateful year of 2010, the immense, invisible pressure inside that golden cage finally reached a critical, unsurvivable mass. The flawless, untouchable image of the perfect country gentleman was about to crack, and the demons that Lib Hatcher had so heroically chased away from the door of that North Carolina courtroom 30 years ago were quietly, aggressively making their way back up the driveway. The king of the radio was about to experience a catastrophic, incredibly public fall from grace, and the world, which had spent 3 decades worshiping his voice, was completely unprepared for the terrifying, chaotic storm that was about to completely destroy his life. The downward spiral, the shattered anchor, and the naked cry for help. There is a catastrophic psychological phenomenon that occurs when a man outlives the very foundation that holds his reality together. For nearly 30 years, the entire universe of Randy Travis was meticulously constructed, managed, and fiercely guarded by one person, his manager and wife, Lib Hatcher. She was the architect of his redemption. She was a woman who had shielded the troubled boy from a prison sentence in the 1970s and guided him to the absolute summit of global superstardom. But a marriage that functions as a multi-million-dollar corporation is a fragile, exhausting vessel. By the late 2000s, the suffocating pressure of maintaining the perfect country music empire had fundamentally hollowed out the romance. In 2010, the unthinkable happened. The most impenetrable partnership in Nashville officially, permanently collapsed. Randy and Lib announced their divorce, dissolving not only a profound, decades-long marriage, but also a legendary business alliance. To understand the terrifying gravity of this moment for Randy Travis, you must strip away the platinum records and the Grammy Awards. You must look at the man. At 51 years old, for the very first time since he was a reckless, terrified teenager facing a judge in a North Carolina courtroom, Randy was entirely, absolutely alone. The anchor had been severed. The golden cage was finally open, but the bird inside had completely forgotten how to fly without a schedule. Without Lib's strict, unwavering management, the highly calibrated machine of his life ground to a chaotic halt. The deep, unresolved traumas of his youth, the crippling anxiety, the unbearable weight of living up to a flawless public image, and the terrifying silence of an empty house came rushing back into his mind like a dark, freezing flood. When a man is drowning in emotional agony and he does not possess the psychological tools to ask for a life raft, he usually reaches for an anesthetic. Randy Travis reached for the bottle. The demons that had been banished 30 years prior quietly walked back up the driveway and made themselves right at home. The descent was not slow. It was a violent, terrifying freefall. In the agonizingly dark year 2012, the pristine, untouchable legacy of the king of country music was brutally, publicly dragged through the mud. In February of that year, police found Randy sitting in his parked car in front of a Baptist church in Sanger, Texas. He smelled heavily of alcohol, clutching an open bottle of wine. There's a profound, almost unbearably tragic poetry to the location of that arrest. He did not get arrested outside a nightclub or a casino. He was arrested in a church parking lot. He was a broken, desperate man literally sitting at the doorstep of God, trying to numb a pain he could not articulate. But the internet is a merciless, unfeeling arena. The media immediately seized upon the mugshot. The man who had sung Forever and Ever Amen at millions of weddings was suddenly the punchline of late-night talk shows. However, the absolute, terrifying climax of his downward spiral occurred just 6 months later, in August of 2012. On a dark, lonely stretch of highway near Tioga, Texas, a 911 call reported a man lying in the middle of the road. When the police arrived, the scene they discovered was so shockingly bizarre, so completely antithetical to the legendary image of Randy Travis, that the world simply could not process it. Randy had crashed his Pontiac Trans Am into a construction zone. He was found combative, heavily intoxicated, and entirely, completely naked. When the police attempted to arrest him, the man who was famous for his gentle, velvet baritone and his polite, Southern manners aggressively threatened the officers. He was restrained, handcuffed, and hauled away into the flashing red and blue lights of the Texas night. The tabloids absolutely feasted on the incident. The naked mugshot, showing a battered, bruised, and glassy-eyed Randy Travis with a black eye and a cut on his face, was broadcast at every corner of the globe. The world pointed their fingers. They mocked him. They wrote cruel articles declaring that the traditional country gentleman was a total fraud, a hypocrite who had finally exposed his true, pathetic colors. But the media completely missed the agonizing, heartbreaking truth of that night. Look closely at the symbolism of a man crashing his car and walking onto freezing asphalt completely naked. That was not a scandal. That was a psychological explosion. He was stripping away the custom-tailored suits. He was stripping away the crushing, unbearable weight of being Randy Travis, the superstar. He was stripping away the 30 years of pretending to be perfect, pretending to be happy, pretending that he wasn't carrying a broken heart. Lying on that cold Texas highway, he was completely defenseless, entirely vulnerable, and stripped of all his Hollywood armor. It was the ultimate, desperate scream of an exhausted human soul. He was a man begging the universe to either fix his agonizing pain or finally, permanently take him away. Reflecting years later on the immense grace required to survive the darkest valleys of human existence, Randy delivered a quote that captures the profound, bleeding humility of a man who has looked the devil in the eye. "I'm a man who has made a lot of mistakes. I've been to the bottom. But I've always believed that God's grace is bigger than our biggest failures. You don't learn much on the mountaintop. You learn everything in the valley. You don't learn much on the mountaintop. You learn everything in the valley. Listen to the staggering truth of those words. For the audiences watching at home, especially those who have watched someone they deeply love spiral into addiction, or those who have made catastrophic, humiliating mistakes in their own lives, this is a moment of profound empathy. We love to judge the fallen star, but the truth is, the only difference between a superstar crashing his car in the dark and an ordinary man crying on his living room floor is the presence of the cameras. In the immediate aftermath of the 2012 arrest, Randy hit absolute rock bottom. He was facing serious legal charges, massive public humiliation, and the complete destruction of his legendary career. But the universe, having allowed him to touch the very bottom of the abyss, was quietly preparing to offer him a second chance. Amidst the wreckage of his life, a woman named Mary Davis stepped into the picture. Mary had known Randy for years, but she now entered his life not as a manager and not as a fan, but as a fiercely protective, unconditional partner. She saw the terrified, broken boy beneath the scandals. She stood by him as he entered a grueling rehabilitation program, holding his hand as he pleaded guilty to the DWI charges, accepted his probation, and began the brutal, quiet work of getting sober and rebuilding his shattered soul. By early 2013, Randy Travis was finally sober. The chaotic, violent storm of his personal life was settling. He was engaged to Mary, and he found a quiet, genuine peace that had eluded him for decades. The media had moved on to the next scandal, and Randy was preparing for a triumphant, quiet return to the music he loved so deeply. He had survived the fire. He had survived the divorce. He had survived the alcohol, the mockery, and the crash. He was standing on solid ground once again. But fate, operated with an almost incomprehensible, terrifying cruelty, was not finished testing the strength of Randy Travis. He had just won the hardest psychological and emotional battle of his entire life, entirely unaware that a microscopic, silent, and catastrophic physical storm was already brewing inside his own body. The universe was about to strike a blow so devastating, so completely unsurvivable, that the naked crash on the Texas highway would soon feel like a minor inconvenience. The ultimate test of human endurance was waiting for him in a sterile hospital room, and the man who had built an empire with his magnificent velvet voice was about to wake up in a terrifying world where that voice was permanently, tragically locked away. The catastrophic storm, the tear, and the stolen voice. There's a profound, terrifying illusion that accompanies survival. When a man fights his way out of the darkness of addiction, survives the brutal, public collapse of a 30-year marriage, and finally finds a quiet, loving sanctuary, he naturally assumes the war is over. He believes that because he has defeated his inner demons, the universe will finally grant him peace. By the summer of 2013, Randy Travis was standing in the sunlight of that hard-won peace. At 54 years old, the alcohol was behind him. The arrests and the humiliating mugshots were fading into the past. He was deeply in love with his fiancée, Mary Davis, and he was preparing to return to the recording studio. The storm had passed, and the sky was completely clear. But the universe does not consult our emotional timelines. And sometimes, the most catastrophic storms do not come from the choices we make. They come from a microscopic, silent, and entirely random ambush deep within our own biology. On July 7th, 2013, Randy was admitted to a hospital in Texas. He had been complaining of a persistent cough and shortness of breath. The initial assumption was that he had simply caught a stubborn respiratory infection, but the reality was a medical nightmare of unimaginable proportions. Randy was diagnosed with viral cardiomyopathy, a terrifying condition where a random viral infection directly attacks and severely weakens the muscles of the heart. Within hours of his admission, his condition rapidly, violently deteriorated. The man who had spent his life commanding massive arenas was suddenly relying on machines just to keep his blood pumping. As the doctors fought desperately to stabilize his failing heart, placing him on life support and a specialized cardiac machine, the ultimate, unimaginable catastrophe occurred. While fighting for his life in the intensive care unit, A massive blood clot formed and traveled to his brain. Randy suffered a devastating, catastrophic stroke. The stroke caused severe swelling, forcing doctors to perform an emergency, high-stakes surgery to remove a section of the skull just to relieve the agonizing pressure on his brain. He was placed into a deep, medically induced coma. The king of country music was lying in a sterile, fluorescent-lit hospital room, completely surrounded by tubes, wires, and the terrifying, rhythmic hissing of a ventilator. It is in these freezing, sterile hallways of an intensive care unit that the true, agonizing weight of human love is tested. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who have stood outside a hospital room, drinking stale coffee, praying to God they haven't spoken to in years, waiting for a doctor to deliver impossible news, the sheer, suffocating terror of this moment is universally understood. The doctors pulled Mary aside. They looked at the woman who had stood by Randy through his darkest scandals, and they delivered an incredibly grim, heartbreaking statistical reality. They told her that Randy's heart had stopped entirely. They had to resuscitate him. They told her that the damage to his brain from the stroke was massive and irreversible. The medical consensus was bleak. They gave him a mere 1 to 2% chance of surviving. And even if he miraculously defied those odds, he would be severely, permanently incapacitated. The doctors gently, professionally suggested that it might be time to let him go. They asked Mary if she wanted to pull the plug. Stop and consider the absolute, crushing agony of that decision. Mary was holding the life of the man she loved in her hands. The entire world was waiting outside, expecting an obituary. The medical science said it was over. But true, fierce, uncompromising love does not listen to statistics. Mary walked into the ICU. She stood by the bed of the man who had sung forever and ever amen to millions of strangers. She looked at his battered, unconscious body. She leaned down, putting her face close to his ear, and she spoke to him with the quiet, desperate ferocity of a woman who refuses to surrender. Years later, Mary recounted that sacred life-or-death conversation with a detail so profound it can bring anyone to tears. I went to his bedside and said, "Baby, you've got to give me some more fight. If you want to keep fighting, you have to give me a sign. But if you're tired and you want to go home to God, I understand. But I need to know." And as I said it, I saw a single tear fall out of his eye, and he squeezed my hand. A single tear, and a squeeze of the hand. That was not a medical reflex. That was the soul of the boy from North Carolina, the boy who had outrun the police and washed dishes in a sweltering kitchen, screaming through the coma that he was not finished yet. Mary walked out of that room, looked the doctors dead in the eye, and told them, "We are fighting." Against all medical logic, against every conceivable odd, Randy Travis survived. He slowly, agonizingly fought his way out of the coma. He spent nearly 6 months in hospitals and rehabilitation centers, battling infections, undergoing multiple surgeries, and slowly waking up to a completely unrecognizable reality. The universe had granted Mary's prayer. It had spared his life. But the cost of that survival was an incredibly cruel Shakespearean tragedy. When Randy finally opened his eyes and attempted to speak, the devastating extent of the stroke's damage was revealed. The stroke had primarily attacked the left side of his brain. While the right side of his body was left partially paralyzed, it was the neurological damage that delivered the ultimate heartbreaking blow. Randy was diagnosed with severe aphasia. Aphasia is a deeply cruel, isolating condition. It does not destroy a person's intelligence. It does not erase their memories. Randy's brilliant mind, his sharp sense of humor, and his memories of every song he had ever written were completely, perfectly intact. He understood everything people were saying to him. But the bridge between his magnificent mind and his mouth had been violently, permanently burned down. The neurological pathways required to form words were destroyed. Think about the staggering, almost incomprehensible irony of the specific disease striking the specific man. Remember the boy in part 1 of our story. The troubled, reckless teenager standing in a North Carolina courtroom, one step away from a prison cell. He had absolutely nothing to his name except an instrument, a deep, resonant, velvet baritone voice. That voice was the key that unlocked his prison door. That voice was the magic that made him a millionaire, an icon, and a savior of traditional country music. His entire identity, his entire fortune, and his entire connection to the world were built on his ability to open his mouth and sing. And now, the universe had placed him in a quiet, invisible cage. The man who made a living articulating the deepest sorrows of the human heart was now trapped inside his own head, completely unable to utter a single, complete sentence. He could only say, yep, nope, and occasionally a quiet amen. The king of the radio had been permanently, tragically muted. For a man of his stature, waking up to find his greatest weapon destroyed could have easily resulted in a descent into complete, impenetrable bitterness. Many men would have cursed God. Many men would have turned their faces to the wall and refused to participate in a world that had taken so much from them. But as Randy sat in his wheelchair, beginning the agonizing, frustrating, and exhausting process of physical therapy, learning how to hold a spoon, learning how to take a single step, he did not succumb to the bitterness. Because while the stroke had taken away his voice, it had completely failed to touch his spirit. And more importantly, as he looked to his side, he saw Mary. She was there, feeding him, holding him, and patiently trying to decipher the complex, vibrant thoughts he could only express through his eyes and his smiles. The world of country music mourned the loss of his voice. They assumed they would never see the legendary Randy Travis on a stage ever again. But they profoundly underestimated the resilience of the man, and they completely underestimated the absolute, mountain-moving power of a woman's love. Mary was about to step into the deafening silence. She was about to become the voice her husband had lost. And together, they were preparing to orchestrate a return to the public eye that would culminate in one of the most sacred, miraculous, and tear-inducing moments in the entire history of American music. The long silence, the Crucible of Rehab, and the Angel of Mercy. There's a profound, incredibly daunting difference between surviving a catastrophic medical storm and actually learning how to live in the quiet, devastated wreckage it leaves behind. When Randy Travis finally opened his eyes in the late summer of 2013, the immediate, terrifying threat of death had passed. The machines that had artificially pumped his heart and inflated his lungs were slowly removed. The universe had miraculously granted him a second chance at life. But as a heavy anesthetic fog lifted from his brain, the boy from North Carolina woke up to discover that his entire world had been fundamentally, violently rewritten. The physical reality of surviving a massive stroke is an agonizing daily crucible. The right side of Randy's body was severely paralyzed. The man who used to confidently stride across massive stadium stages, holding a guitar and commanding the attention of 20,000 screaming fans, was now confined to a wheelchair. He had to learn how to perform the most basic, fundamental functions of human existence all over again. He had to learn how to sit up. He had to learn how to hold a spoon. He had to endure the excruciating, deeply humbling process of physical therapy, fighting for months just to command his leg to take a single, trembling step. But the physical paralysis was incredibly minor compared to the devastating, invisible prison of aphasia. To truly understand the psychological torture of severe aphasia, you must imagine a library where all the books are perfectly intact, but the doors are permanently padlocked. Randy's magnificent, brilliant mind was completely unharmed. His memories, his sharp sense of humor, his deep faith, and the lyrics to every single song he had ever written were perfectly preserved inside his head. But when he opened his mouth to share those thoughts with the world, the bridge was simply gone. The neurological pathways required to translate his complex, vibrant thoughts into audible language had been completely incinerated by the stroke. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated frustration of that daily reality. Imagine a nurse asking you a simple question, and you know the exact, detailed answer in your mind. But when you command your throat and your tongue to deliver the words, all that emerges is a quiet, struggling yep or nope. For a man who had built his entire identity, his billion-dollar empire, and his ultimate redemption on the flawless, velvet delivery of his baritone voice, this sudden, permanent silence could have easily, understandably destroyed his spirit. Many men would have surrendered to a deep, impenetrable bitterness. They would have lashed out in anger, cursing a God who would grant them survival only to strip them of their voice. But Randy Travis did not become bitter. And the reason he did not succumb to the darkness is because he did not have to walk through the silence alone. In the notoriously fickle, superficial world of the entertainment industry, marriages are frequently treated as conditional contracts. When the lights go out, when the money stops flowing, or when a glamorous superstar is suddenly transformed into a vulnerable, incapacitated patient requiring round-the-clock medical care, the entourage usually disappears. The industry moves on to the next bright, shiny object. But Mary Davis was not a Hollywood cliché. She was a force of absolute, uncompromising, fierce devotion. During those agonizing months in the rehabilitation centers, Mary never left his side. She became his physical shield and his emotional translator. She learned to read the incredibly subtle, microscopic shifts in his facial expressions. She learned to communicate with him through the gentle squeeze of a hand, a knowing glance, and the deep, profound language of his eyes. When Randy would become intensely frustrated, his eyes welling with tears because the words simply refused to come out, Mary did not pity him. She did not treat him like a broken celebrity. She held his face, looked directly into his eyes, and reminded him of his absolute, undeniable worth as a human being. Reflecting on the monumental, daily challenge of aphasia and the silent, beautiful communication they developed, Mary later delivered a quote of such profound, tear-inducing grace that it should be etched into the heart of every person who has ever cared for a sick loved one. I tell him all the time, you speak volumes to me without saying a single word. The music stopped, but the melody kept playing in his heart. We just had to learn a different way to hear it. You speak volumes to me without saying a single word. Listen to the breathtaking magnitude of that love. For the audiences watching at home, especially the wives, the husbands, the sons, and the daughters who have sacrificed their own lives, their sleep, and their comfort to become the full-time caregivers for a declining loved one, Mary's devotion is the ultimate, magnificent anthem of validation. Caregiving is an invisible, exhausting, and frequently thankless labor. It involves bathing, feeding, lifting, and maintaining the quiet, sacred dignity of someone who can no longer do it for themselves. Mary did not just become Randy's nurse. She became the fierce, uncompromising guardian of his dignity. She became the voice he had lost. And in 2015, 2 years after the catastrophic stroke that had nearly killed him, Randy and Mary made a decision that completely redefines the concept of romantic commitment. On March 21st, 2015, Randy Travis and Mary Davis were officially married. Stop and consider the absolute, staggering beauty of this timeline. Mary did not walk down the aisle to marry a multimillionaire superstar at the absolute peak of his physical and commercial power. She did not marry the man who was selling out arenas and winning Grammy Awards. She put on a wedding dress, stood beside a man sitting in a wheelchair, a man who could barely walk and who could not even speak the words of his own wedding vows, and she promised to love him for the rest of her life. When a couple stands at an altar and says the words, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, it is usually an abstract, theoretical promise about a distant, unpredictable future. But for Mary and Randy, it was not a theory. It was the absolute, heavy, and undeniable reality of their everyday existence. She looked at the wheelchair, she looked at the silent, frustrating battles with aphasia, and she said, yes, I choose this. That is not a Hollywood romance. That is a sacrament. Secured by the bulletproof armor of his wife's unconditional love, Randy's spirit experienced a magnificent, quiet resurrection. He accepted his new reality with a grace that left his doctors and his friends in absolute awe. The anger dissipated. The frustration melted away. He learned to smile again, a wide, genuine, deeply peaceful smile that radiated an inner light far brighter than any spotlight he had ever stood under. He realized that the universe had not punished him by taking away his voice. The universe had stripped away the grueling tours, the toxic pressure of the music industry, and the terrifying demons of his past, and had left him with the only two things that actually fundamentally matter in the end: his life and a woman who loved his soul. As the calendar turned toward the year 2016, the country music industry, which had spent 3 years mourning the tragic, permanent silence of one of its greatest kings, prepared to bestow its ultimate, highest honor upon him. Randy Travis had been elected to the Country Music Hall of Fame. The industry planned a massive, respectful induction ceremony in Nashville. The executives, the fellow artists, and the global press expected a deeply melancholic, quiet evening. They expected Mary to wheel Randy onto the stage, where he would sit in dignified silence while his wife delivered a tearful acceptance speech on his behalf. They expected to pay tribute to a voice that had been permanently locked away in the archives of history. But the world, once again, completely underestimated the miraculous, resilient, and deeply divine nature of the boy from North Carolina. As Randy sat in his chair, looking out at the glittering crowd of his peers in 2016, something absolutely impossible was quietly preparing to unfold. The man who had been silenced by a catastrophic neurological storm was about to stand up, look the universe directly in the eye, and deliver a moment of such profound, staggering, and tear-inducing magic that would permanently rewrite the history of American music. The miracle of grace, the silent king, and the ultimate redemption. There are moments in human history that completely defy the cold, clinical boundaries of medical science. Moments where the sheer, unadulterated willpower of the human spirit simply bypasses the broken architecture of the physical body, reaching into a deeply spiritual dimension to pull off an absolute miracle. On the evening of October 16th, 2016, the country music industry gathered in a lavishly illuminated auditorium in Nashville, Tennessee. It was a night of immense, heavy emotion. Randy Travis was officially being inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The greatest legends of the genre, men and women who had sold millions of records and filled massive stadiums, sat in the audience, their eyes already welling with tears. They were looking at the stage, where Randy Travis, the man who had single-handedly saved traditional country music in the 1980s, sat quietly in a wheelchair. His right arm was motionless. His face bore the unmistakable, heavy toll of the catastrophic 2013 stroke. Beside him stood his fiercely devoted wife, Mary. She leaned into the microphone to deliver the acceptance speech on his behalf. She spoke beautifully about his resilience, about the grueling, agonizing days in the rehabilitation center, and about the thousands of hours they had spent just trying to reclaim a single syllable. The audience listened in respectful, absolute silence. They assumed this was the poignant, melancholic end of the ceremony. They assumed the great mahogany baritone of Randy Travis was permanently, tragically locked away in the silent vault of a severe aphasia. But as Mary concluded her speech, she turned to her husband. She gently placed her hand on his shoulder. And then Mary stepped back from the microphone, leaving the space open for the man in the wheelchair. Randy Travis slowly, painstakingly stood up from his chair. The room went completely, breathlessly still. The silence was deafening. Every single superstar in the audience leaned forward, watching as a man who could not string together a conversational sentence stared out at the crowd. And then Randy Travis opened his mouth. He did not speak. He sang, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." It was not the flawless, powerful, velvety baritone that had dominated the radio in 1986. The voice was strained. It was fragile. He struggled with the breath, and the pitch wavered with the immense required just to push the melody past the permanent damage in his brain. But to the people sitting in that room, and to the millions of people who would eventually watch the footage around the world, it was the most beautiful, perfect, and magnificent sound they had ever heard in their entire lives. Garth Brooks was weeping. Brad Paisley was sobbing. Grown men and women, titans of the industry, openly broke down in tears, completely overwhelmed by the profound, majestic impossibility of what they were witnessing. Neurologists and speech therapists have a fascinating, deeply poetic explanation for this phenomenon. They explain that while a severe stroke on the left side of the brain can completely destroy a person's ability to speak conversational words, the ability to sing, the retention of melody, rhythm, and deeply ingrained lyrics is often stored on the right side of the brain. The music literally bypasses the neurological roadblock. But to the people in that room in 2016, it was not biology. It was not science. It was an absolute, undeniable touch of the divine. Think about the staggering, almost overwhelmingly perfect irony of the song he chose. That saved a wretch like me. He was singing about the reckless, terrified 19-year-old boy in North Carolina, staring down a prison sentence, who was saved by a judge's mercy and a woman's belief. He was singing about the superstar who was drowning in the dark, suffocating abyss of a church parking lot with a bottle of alcohol, naked and screaming for help on a Texas highway. He was singing about the man who was given a 1% chance to live in a freezing ICU, whose life was saved by the fierce, uncompromising love of his wife, Mary. The grace had found him in the mud. The grace had found him in the spotlight. And the grace had found him in the wheelchair. Today, as we look at Randy Travis in the year 2026, at 66 years old, the frantic, desperate, and often chaotic noise of his existence has completely faded away. He still cannot carry on a complex conversation. The aphasia remains a permanent, heavy roommate in his life. But if you see Randy Travis today, you will witness a man who has achieved the ultimate, breathtaking victory over his own ego. He frequently attends the concerts of younger country music artists. Mary wheels him to the side of the stage. The young superstars, the kids who grew up listening to Storms of Life and learning how to play the guitar because of his records, walk over to his wheelchair, take their hats off, and kneel beside him in absolute reverence. And Randy? He smiles. It is not the forced, exhausted, manufactured smile of a pop star trying to appease a crowd. It is a massive, radiant, deeply peaceful smile that reaches all the way into his eyes. He listens to other people sing the songs he wrote. He listens to the thousands of fans in the arena singing the lyrics back to him. He does not need to sing anymore because the world is singing for him. The profound literary symmetry of Randy Travis's life is now complete. The universe gave a troubled, dangerous boy an instrument of unimaginable beauty to save him from a dark, violent end. That voice carried him out of poverty, carried him across the globe, and allowed him to comfort millions of broken hearts. But once the voice had done its job, once the boy had finally, truly learned how to be loved for who he was, and not just for what he could do, the universe quietly reached down and took the instrument back. He lost his voice. But in the agonizing, beautiful silence that followed, he finally found his soul. The golden cage is gone. The demons of alcohol and pressure have been permanently banished. What remains is a 66-year-old man, sitting quietly beside the woman who fought the devil for his life, surrounded by the echoes of a legacy that will absolutely outlast us all. He is the king of country music. He is the survivor of the storm. And as he sits in the peaceful twilight of his magnificent, heavily scarred life, he is a living, breathing embodiment of an amazing, everlasting grace. As the final, beautiful chords fade on the extraordinary, heartbreaking, and miraculously triumphant story of Randy Travis, the camera turns away from the silent legend, and it focuses deeply, gently on you. Randy's journey is profound, staggering reminder how incredibly fragile our lives truly are. In the blink of an eye, a stroke, an illness, or an accident can permanently steal the very things we take for granted. It can steal our mobility. It can steal our independence. It can even steal our voice. But as Randy and Mary have shown the entire world, disease can steal your words, but it can never, ever steal your melody. It can never erase the love that you have built. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment in your own life where the universe suddenly, violently stripped something precious away from you? Have you or someone you love had to learn how to navigate the terrifying, quiet world of a devastating medical diagnosis? And for the caregivers watching this, those of you who become the voice, the hands, and the shield for a spouse or parent, how do you find your own amazing grace in the darkest, most exhausting moments of night? Please, do not let your silent battles go unnoticed. Share your stories of survival, your struggles with illness, and your beautiful testaments of unconditional love in the comments below. There are people reading these comments right now who are sitting in a hospital waiting room, terrified and exhausted, and your story of resilience might be the exact miracle they need to keep fighting today. If Randy Travis's incredible journey moved you, if it reminded you that true love does not run away when the music stops, but simply learns how to listen in the quiet, please leave a like on this video. Share it with someone you care about, especially those heroes who act as caregivers in their own families. And subscribe to our channel, because we are committed to telling the deep, unfiltered, and profoundly human stories behind the legends we thought we knew. Thank you, deeply and truly, for spending your time with us today. Remember to be patient with those who are struggling to find their words. Cherish the silence with the people you love. And no matter how fierce the storm gets, never forget the grace that brought you here. Until next time,